Have you ever been treated like a nuisance in the house you own, helped to build? I went, and not for strangers, but for my own family. That morning, my hands were wet with soap, folding the clothes I had taken out of the washing machine, when my daughter-in-law approached and, with a tone that mixed contempt and impatience, said, "If you want to keep living here, do our laundry every week. Consider it paying the rent." At that moment, I froze. I felt a lump in my throat, but I didn't respond. I just stared at the floor, swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation. Maybe she doesn't know, but I've done much more than just laundry. In this life, I've scrubbed floors, cared for sick children, managed bills in desperate times, and offered shelter when no one else would even offer a plate of food. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like your entire history, your entire worth, was reduced to a favor no one asked for? My name is Helen. I'm 73 years old and have been a widow for 10 years. And if someone saw my life today, they might think I'm just another grandmother living with her son and daughter-in-law, depending on them. But what no one realizes is that that house, half of it is mine. It was bought with the money from the sale of the house where I lived with my husband for 40 years. I donated everything I had to give my son a better life. And, ironically, it was in that same house that I began to feel like an unwelcome guest. They say time brings wisdom, but the truth is, with time, we learn to swallow our pain in silence. We learn to smile, even when we're being despised. We learn that respect doesn't always come with the passing of years. Sometimes it disappears with our children's youth. How many times have I heard that door slam without anyone asking if I wanted to leave too? How many times have they had dinner together and just left me the rest? And yet, I kept going, thinking that one day they would see that maybe a loving gesture, a tight hug, could remind me that I was still part of that family. But no. The stark truth is that, to them, I've become a burden, an obligation, a nuisance that takes up space and consumes energy. You are a burden, not with those words, but with looks, with actions, with the coldness of someone who's forgotten where they came from. I was silent that day. I washed the clothes, I folded each item carefully, as I always did, but inside me, something changed. I didn't cry, I planned, and that's when I realized I wasn't the one who had to pay to stay there. They were the ones occupying a space that was also mine, and more than that, they were abusing my presence, my kindness, my silence. But every story has a turning point, and mine was about to happen. I slept little that night. The pillow seemed soaked not with tears, but with thoughts. I relived every word my daughter-in-law said, every sidelong glance, every dismissive gesture, and most of all, I felt the weight of silence. The silence of years of swallowing my pride, keeping quiet to avoid arguments, and accepting less than I deserved just to keep the peace. But there, alone in my room, surrounded by memories of a lifetime of sacrifice, I finally saw what was happening to me wasn't just a family disagreement. It was disrespect. It was contempt disguised as coexistence. And you know what hurt me most? Knowing I'm not alone. How many other mothers, grandmothers, and women have heard something similar? How many have been treated like a burden within their own family? If anything in this story has upset you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, reading a comment about a similar experience makes us feel less alone. And each story shared below helps show that this pain isn't invisible. It has a voice, and it deserves to be heard. Like this video if at any point you felt this story could be yours, because this simple gesture makes YouTube show this content to more people who, like me, have already swallowed a lot of humiliation in silence. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, not to stir up controversy, but to raise awareness, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is made with soul. It's for those who carry scars that no one sees, but who no longer want to live in silence, because together, we transform pain into dignity. And what comes next? We'll show you how even silence can become justice. I'm just a grandmother. At least that's what I thought still meant something. Time passes, and we get used to the idea that we're gradually being forgotten. Conversations diminish, hugs become rare, and glances lose that spark of affection. At first, I thought it was normal. Their lives move on, their children grow, their grandchildren have other distractions. But as the days, months, years passed, I began to realize that what was happening went deeper. It was as if I had become part of the furniture, useful but invisible, Helen Carter, 73, widowed since age 63. When my husband passed away, I buried not only the love of my life, but also a good part of my emotional security. He was always my safe haven, my partner in every battle. We built a simple but dignified life. We raised our son with great care, providing him with education, shelter, and more love than we could measure. I made a point of being there for every fever, every report card, every school presentation, and when he grew up, I didn't stop. I made a point of supporting him when he got married. I sold my house, the one where I'd lived with my husband for 4 decades, and used half the proceeds to help with the down payment on the new house where he and his wife would live. It was a decision made with my heart, with the mindset of a mother who wants to see her child well, comfortable, and stable. I've never regretted it because a mother's love has no return. But what no one knows, and I never told them, is that deed, that blessed deed that now makes them the owners of the house, it still bears my name. And not on a whim, but because when I made the transfer, the lawyer advised keeping half in my name, just in case. I didn't pay much attention at the time. I thought I'd never need it. Until that day, when I heard that phrase from my daughter-in-law, something awakened inside me. It was as if a veil had fallen from my eyes. I realized the problem wasn't just a rude remark. It was a buildup, a hidden truth I'd been trying to ignore. The way she treated me wasn't the result of a bad day. It was the way she'd always seen me, a burden tolerated out of obligation. And that tore me apart. I found myself remembering the small gestures, the times I bought medicine for my grandson without saying a word, the nights I stayed up waiting for them to come home late and tired, just to keep the food warm. The birthdays I prepared everything myself and didn't even hear a happy birthday. No one ever asked how I felt. No one cared about my fears, my sleepless nights, the silence that accompanied me as I folded clothes that weren't even mine. But I felt it, and I still feel it. Every little oversight. Every time the table was set without considering whether I was hungry. Every morning I woke up wanting to talk and was ignored as if I weren't even there. It was at this point in my journey that something began to change. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a revolt. It was a kind of silent but powerful decision, like someone who sees their own life from the outside and decides, this isn't how I want to live anymore. There, in that house where everyone thought I was just taking up space, I began to reorganize my memories, my choices, my strengths, and I realized that even though I was called useless, I still had something no one there seemed to have: memory, truth, and dignity. Behind the scenes of this invisible routine was a woman who had moved mountains unseen, who had held the ceiling upright when it threatened to collapse, who had silenced her own pain to ensure the comfort of others. And that's when I realized, maybe being a grandmother today means something different. Maybe it's no longer just about taking care of grandchildren or cooking on Sundays. Maybe now is the time to teach, to show what it means to have a history, what it means to have a past and still be strong enough to transform the present. If any word of this story has remained engraved in your heart, write it here in the comments. Dignity does not age, because sometimes all we need is to remember who we are, even when the world forgets. It was a late afternoon. Like so many others, I was in the laundry room, carefully folding sheets, still warm from the clothesline. I've always had this fondness for small tasks, not for the work itself, but for the meaning. It was my silent way of continuing to serve, of showing that, even with age, I was still useful. Vanessa entered as if intruding, without knocking, without looking. She carried a basket full of dirty clothes, underwear, socks, crumpled pants, and, without saying a word, she dropped everything at my feet. There was no weight in her gesture, only disdain. A contempt so cold it burned. And then, as if delivering an informal warning, she blurted out, "If you want to keep living here, that's the bare minimum. Do the laundry every week." I froze. Outwardly, I remained motionless, the sheet between my fingers. Inside, it was as if a silent crack had begun to cut through everything that remained whole within me. The way she spoke, the absence of a please, of a human look, of a simple "Are you okay?" was louder than any scream. "No thanks," she said. She just threw the basket on the floor. It wasn't about laundry. It never was. I've done too much laundry in my life. Children's clothes, mud-stained clothes, clothes stained with blood from my son's bruised knees when he was little. Washing was the least of it. What tore me apart was realizing that, in her mind, I was there by favor. As if that roof were a concession, a favor granted to me beyond, not a space that also belonged to me, built with my decisions, my effort, my history. It was as if I were an unwanted guest who had to pay somehow, and, worse, pay with service. In that instant, I realized the kind of mindset she carried. She wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law, nor a stressed-out woman. She was someone who chose to see me as a burden. And more than that, as disposable, invisible. As if my worth were tied to my ability to serve, to fold, scrub, wash and be silent. She turned her back and left, as if she hadn't said anything, and I was left there, surrounded by dirty clothes, but feeling like what was really being scrubbed in the sink was my dignity. I could have reacted, I could have said 1,000 things, but I remained silent. Not out of fearing too old to fear words anymore. I remained silent because, in that moment, I understood that I was dealing with something bigger than a simple domestic insult. I was facing a revelation, a hidden truth that had been hidden in the details of everyday life. The way she avoided eye contact, the whispered conversations with my son as soon as I left the room, the decisions made without consulting me, even when they involved matters that affected my daily life, the invitations that never came when they went out to eat. It was all part of a pattern, a script of contempt carefully disguised as coexistence. That's when my transformation began, not because I decided to confront them at that moment, but because I decided I would no longer accept that narrative, that I would no longer be a supporting character in my own story. Maybe they didn't know it, but the impact of that sentence touched more than just my heart. It touched my very essence. I am a woman. I am a mother. I am a grandmother. And, above all, I am someone with a story, who has cried a lot in secret, but who hasn't forgotten how to look someone in the eye firmly. The strangest thing is that, after that, everything remained seemingly the same. Vanessa continued her superiority act. My son Mark pretended not to see, but inside me, something had changed forever. If this part of the story touched you in any way, write here, in the comments. That also has a name, because sometimes, naming what we feel, is already the beginning of change. That night, I didn't cry. For the first time in a long time, the pillow wasn't complicit in my tears. Instead, I turned over, stared at the ceiling, and began to do math, not math, but history, of presence, of sacrifices, and choices. While the house slept, silence kept me company. But it wasn't a silence of sadness. It was a silence of decision. I mentally reviewed every aspect of my life up until that point: the sale of my old house, the money I'd saved so hard, the decision to give half of it to my son and his new family to build a future. I remembered the conversation with my husband just before he left. He'd said, "Helen, save a piece of your name in this soil. You never know what tomorrow will bring." At the time, it seemed like an exaggeration, but now it all made sense. I stood up slowly, went to the desk drawer where I keep my old files, and pulled out the manila envelope. Inside, the contract, the yellowed paper from years ago, and there, in firm letters, was my name. Equally, half the house was mine. Not on loan, not by favor, but by right. A detail no one else remembered, or pretended not to remember. In that instant, something inside me shifted into alignment. It was as if my weary soul had found an invisible pillar to lean on. The pain was still there, but it had been pushed aside by a new force, a force I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, it was clarity, a lucidity so acute it cut through any doubt. From that moment on, I stopped being a guest, and became the owner of the house. Of course, I wasn't going to go shouting this down the halls. I'm not one for scandal. My nature is the silent one that observes, listens, and acts when necessary. But inside my head, the gears began to turn. With the calm of someone who has faced greater pain, I began mentally organizing the next steps. The most interesting thing is that, as I rebuilt myself internally, the environment around me didn't change. The same tasks, the same indifferent glances, the same lunches where no one asked how I was. But now, I saw everything from a new perspective. No longer as someone who needed to be accepted, but as someone who was already there, on her own merits. It was a silent but definitive transformation. My mindset shifted. I no longer felt like a shadow. I was part of the structure. And no matter how much they tried to push me backstage, I now knew exactly where I was, at the center of my own story. And it was from there that I would make my next decisions. I started paying more attention to every word spoken, every gesture, not out of paranoia, but out of strategy. After all, when we decide to stop being underestimated, every detail matters, and every small disrespect, once tolerated, now became proof of a larger narrative, of a truth that needed to be exposed, because this wasn't just my story, it reflected so many others. Women who gave their lives for their families and, as they grew older, were pushed to the sidelines. But I wasn't born to end up like this, and I realized that, even at 73, I could still change the course of things, with intelligence, with dignity, with justice. If this moment brought back any memories or feelings you've been keeping to yourself, write them in the comments below. Now I remember who I am. Because sometimes, remembering our own strength is all we need to start rewriting our path the next day. Right after breakfast, I grabbed my old cell phone and looked up a number I hadn't dialed in years. It was Mr. Wallace, the lawyer who had handled the house purchase. A discreet, soft-spoken man who always treated me with respect. When he answered, his voice sounded like a bridge between the past and the present. "Mrs. Carter, long time no see. Wallace, do you still have that copy of the deed to the house?" He paused briefly, and then replied, "Yes, I do. It's archived." "Why?" I took a deep breath. It wasn't time to explain everything. I just said, "I need to officially confirm what I already know. I need the document, signed and notarized. Can you send me a digital copy and a printed copy?" His voice became more serious. "Of course, I can send it by email today, and the physical copy by courier tomorrow. Is everything okay with you?" I just replied, "Now, it will stay." I hung up feeling like I'd taken the first step on my journey, a journey unlike any I've experienced as a mother, wife, or caregiver. This was my journey as a woman who decided to take charge of her own destiny. It wasn't revenge, it was repair. From then on, I began to observe everything with new eyes. The routine of the house became the stage for silent scenes that held profound meanings. I saw Vanessa rush off to work, leave the dirty dishes in the sink, and bark orders as if I were an employee. Her tone wasn't offensive, it was natural, automatic, but therein lay the greatest offense, the certainty that I would never respond. That's why I started recording. With my cell phone in my apron pocket, I activated the voice recorder whenever I sensed a humiliating phrase. It wasn't difficult, all it took was preparing lunch a little late, forgetting to add salt, or being late picking up my grandson from school. All it took was being human for their mask of cordiality to slip. The messages in the family group also became tests. Certain words, even written, hurt more than shouts. "Helen needs to understand that the house isn't just hers," Vanessa wrote one Sunday night. And, at another point, she should be grateful for having a place to live. Not everyone is that lucky. These words, though cloaked in rationality, revealed the mentality behind the coexistence. I was treated as a beneficiary of favors, not as someone who contributed materially and emotionally to the existence of that home. Behind the scenes of my household routine, my plan was delicately taking shape. I organized the recordings, printed the messages, and gathered the documents. I put everything in a blue folder, just like the ones I'd used my whole life to keep my son's bills and vaccination records. Ironic, isn't it? The papers that had once served to protect him were now serving to protect me. And even while I cooked, cared for my grandson, or cleaned the corners of the house that no one could see, my mind operated with the precision of someone who knew exactly where it was going. I began to write everything down in a notebook: day, time, phrase, context. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle I was silently putting together. It was as if I had gone back to school, but now my subject was the truth, and my goal was to restore the dignity that had been taken from me without warning. Over time, I realized that my strength didn't come from anger. It came from conviction. It came from the certainty that the respect I'd been denied within myself could still be regained, not by imposition, but by strategy. A slow but steady transformation. Not the kind that explodes overnight, but the kind that grows silently from within, and that no one can stop. And it was there, between the beans on the stove and the notes hidden in the cupboard drawer, that I understood. Sometimes, the greatest form of resistance is to continue acting normally, while everything inside reorganizes itself to become history. If you've ever experienced something that made you plan in silence, write here in the comments. Inside, I already knew, because there are things we feel long before saying them out loud. The curious thing is that, even with all this activity, behind the scenes, no one in the house noticed. It was as if I had truly become invisible. And this, in a way, worked in my favor. The silence that had once been loneliness was now strategy. The indifference that had once hurt now served as a screen for my steps. But between a cup of tea and a note in my notebook, I also thought about how many other women must be experiencing exactly this silent hurt, but still standing strong. Because pain, when it finds no outlet, becomes resistance. And that's why telling this story here carries so much weight. If anything in this story has upset you, leave a comment below to share what bothered you most. Perhaps you've also experienced harsh words, sharp looks, or felt like you were outside your own home. Your comment could be a hug for someone going through the same thing. And if this type of content touches you in any way, like the video. It makes all the difference. YouTube understands that this message is worth spreading, and it reaches more people who need to hear it or recognize themselves. And if you want to continue following stories like this, with truth, emotion, and that feeling that it feels like it happened to me, subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what keeps all this alive. It's what transforms this space into a place of listening, of identification, of shared strength. There are pains we carry for years, but when we hear someone putting into words what we've never been able to say, something opens up. So, comment, like, subscribe, because this story isn't over yet, and you're a part of it now. That morning, the sun streamed through the window, as always, warm, gentle, almost ironic, because inside the house, the atmosphere was different. I already knew it was the day the mortgage payment was due. The same ritual every month. Vanessa's husband sighed heavily at the bill. She complained that the bills didn't add up, and I listened, silent, while I cleared the coffee table as if apologizing for existing. But this time, there was something different, a tension in the air. Vanessa was more impatient than usual. She paced back and forth with the paper in her hand, occasionally giving me glances that couldn't quite hide their discomfort. I, on the other hand, was calm. My calm was the kind only those who know the truth feel. The hidden truth, the one that changes everything, and that, silently, prepared me for that very moment. She approached slowly, as if she wanted to control the situation from the first second. She placed the bill on the table next to my cup and said in that tone that mixed false cordiality with veiled demand, "Ms. Helen, I know you've been helping with the shopping, but it would be fair if you helped with the rent too. After all, there are 3 adults living here." She didn't even wait for an answer. She crossed her arms, as if the silence were agreement. But this time, there was no silence inside me. There was certainty. There was the weight of an entire journey, supporting me from within. I calmly stood up, grabbed the blue folder from the kitchen cabinet, the simplest place to store something so important, and placed it on the table. I looked her in the eye, not with anger, but with dignity, as if finally assuming the role that had always been hers. "You can keep the money," I said. Vanessa frowned in confusion. "I already paid," I added. I spoke to the owner of the house. In this case, myself. The silence that followed was thick. Not even the clock on the wall dared mark the time. She blinked several times, as if trying to process it. My son entered the room at that moment, cell phone in hand, and stopped when he saw the scene. I simply slid the document across the table, the deed, with my name on it, the copy signed by the lawyer, notarized, and everything. Vanessa stared at the paper as if she were seeing a ghost. And that's when I realized, the biggest surprise for her wasn't that I had a right to the house, it was that I'd acted with such precision. She'd expected fragility, submission, perhaps tears. But she found another woman, one who, behind the white hair and simple clothes, had decided to change her own destiny. No one said anything for several long seconds. My son, visibly uncomfortable, approached the table and read the document. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if reality had finally dawned on him. Vanessa took a step back, trying to gather what remained of her pride. But there was no shouting, no fighting, just a revelation, the kind that, once exposed, can no longer be hidden. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the house changed. Not because of me. I continued doing everything the same way, caring, organizing, making myself present. But now, my every gesture, carried a new weight, the weight of truth. The silent transformation that was now laid bare before them, and even without saying it, everyone knew the rules of the game had changed. If you've ever experienced a moment when the truth became your greatest strength, write in the comments. I also spoke to the owner of the house, because sometimes a single sentence is enough to remind us that we were never as weak as they wanted us to believe. The paper sat there, on the table, like a mirror reflecting not only the legal truth, but an entire story of invisibility finally taking shape. It was more than a document, it was a piece of my voice, which for years had been hidden between the cracks of tolerance and hope. Now, there was no more room for pretense. Vanessa tried to hide it, as if looking for a quick argument to regain control. But why didn't you ever say anything? She asked, her voice low, somewhere between curiosity and embarrassment. I took a deep breath, because I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But you needed to remember where this ground you walk on came from. She lowered her eyes. For the first time, there was no haughtiness. There was discomfort. A kind of shame that streamed down her face even without tears. My son, Mark, remained silent. And it was his silence that hurt me the most, because he knew, deep down, he knew. He knew about the sale of the old house, the conversation with his father, the contract split between two names. He simply chose to forget. He chose not to interfere. Maybe he thought time would make me forget too, but time doesn't erase what's right. Time, at most, matures. And that's what happened to me. I matured until I understood that being good doesn't mean being stupid. And that dignity isn't something we ask for, it's something we assume. That moment was my turning point. The impact of that confrontation was greater than any scream, because there was no humiliation. There was clarity. There was no attack. There was exposure. And, most importantly, there was no revenge. There was justice. Vanessa pushed away from the table and walked into the hallway. She entered the room without another word. Mark remained there, standing there, looking at me as if he finally saw me, not the helpful mother, not the grandmother who helps with the children, not the woman who makes lunch every day without complaining, but the woman who was there whole, with a history, with rights, with a name, with strength. He tried to say something, but no words came. He just shook his head slightly and left. I was left alone in the room for a few moments, standing there, staring at that paper on the table, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt secure. I felt like I was my own person. The days that followed were different. There were no apologies. None were needed. Attitudes changed. Conversations were more cautious. Looks more respectful. And even the silence began to sound different, less burdened, more attentive, as if they had finally understood something I'd always known. I wasn't a favor. I was part of the fabric of that house, of that family's history. This turning point didn't erase the pain, nor heal the years-long wounds, but it changed my attitude toward them. It gave me something that neither time, nor age, nor contempt can take away: awareness. The awareness of who I am, of what I've done, and how much I deserve to be treated with dignity. And if there's one thing this moment taught me, it's that sometimes silence can be stronger than any speech, but there are times when you need to break that silence, not with shouts, but with truth. If you've ever experienced something similar, or if you ever felt like you needed to keep quiet more than you should, write here in the comments. Truth has a name, because naming what we experience is the first step to not allowing ourselves to be erased again. In the days that followed, the house looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything was different. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, and the light finally revealed what each of them preferred to keep hidden. No one spoke of what had happened, but the silence, which had previously been routine, now had a different weight. It was the silence of someone who had been unmet, of someone who had finally seen themselves. Mark tried to reach out, in small gestures, in casual conversations in the hallway, in timid questions like, "Do you need anything, Mom?" But it was too late to resume that role of solicitous son he'd abandoned so long ago, because what was at stake here wasn't a favor, a kindness. It was something deeper. It was the acknowledgement of my existence. And this, for years, he chose to ignore. I wasn't harsh. I never was, but I was firm. I looked him in the eye during one of those attempts at conversation and said, my voice low, but with each word carrying the weight of an ancient truth, "I don't need you to take care of me, Mark. I need you to see me." He fell silent. He lowered his eyes, and I went on my way. Because it's one thing to forgive. It's another to forget who you became in front of the one you loved most. Vanessa, in turn, lost something she had always cherished: control of the narrative. For years, she had dictated the rules of coexistence. She chose the words, the dynamics, what was acceptable and what wasn't within the house. But after that morning when the truth came out, nothing fit her mold anymore. Decisions no longer met with her silent approval, and her usual coldness began to clash with something she had never known how to handle: consequences. She began to be noticed differently by the other family members. The looks on her relatives' faces during Sunday visits carried a sense of doubt, a sense of distrust, and although no one said anything openly, she knew the story had leaked through the cracks of their relationship, and now her image wasn't as well defined as it once was. And that's when I realized one of the hardest, yet most liberating truths of this journey. Sometimes, what destroys isn't action, it's the lack of it. It wasn't a scandal that brought about this downfall. It was the accumulation of small omissions, indifferences, unspoken words, and cold gestures. It was the lack of real presence, the subtle and ongoing lack of respect, disguised as normality. And that's what I chose to never allow again. I continued living in the same house, the same room, the same furniture, the same view from the window, but now, I lived there differently. No longer as someone taking up space, but as someone asserting their presence, who sets boundaries, who refuses to be molded by the convenience of others. I started saying no, calmly, politely, but firmly. Not when they asked me to make dinner alone after a tiring day. Not when they expected me to pick up my grandson without asking if I could. Not when they implied that certain decisions were best not to involve you. My decision, now, was to live with dignity. Age doesn't matter. Relationships don't matter, because respect isn't asked for, it's imposed with presence. And the biggest turning point of all was realizing that when we take a stand, even in silence, the world around us needs to reorganize itself. That's what happened there. The structure of that house, previously entirely focused on Vanessa's desires and Mark's inaction, now revolved around a new truth. I was no longer a shadow, and they knew it. If you've ever had to relearn how to exist within your own home, write here in the comments. I also got my place back, because sometimes the place was always ours, we just needed to remember how to occupy it. Sometimes we discover that courage also has a cost, and most of the time, it's not a small one. The house remained silent, not the uncomfortable, suffocating kind, but the kind of silence that keeps things in place, that rearranges the space without moving furniture. I continued with my routine. My tea in the morning, my embroidery in the afternoon, my reading at night. But there was a space between one thing and another that had previously been filled with glances, speech, sounds. Now, it was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that only appears when the truth has been told and when it can no longer be undone. Mark didn't avoid me, but he also didn't approach me as lightly as before. Vanessa barely exchanged words with me, and when she did, her tone was restrained, measured, as if she were obliged to speak. Her grandson still ran around the house and sometimes came to give me a kiss. But even he seemed to sense that something had changed and that it wasn't just the calendar. It was in this new daily routine that I discovered that courage, when it comes, doesn't just take away fear, it also takes away some companions. It takes away the fake smiles, the forced conversations, the facades, and, in return, it delivers something deeper: dignity. I traded company for silence, but I gained something priceless: dignity. It wasn't an easy transition. There were nights when I found myself staring at the empty chair on the porch and wondering if, perhaps, I'd overreacted, if it was really necessary to come clean, if that warm peace from before, even if full of deception, wasn't more comfortable than this cold truth that now surrounded me. But every time this doubt struck, I remembered my own story. Of the woman who always served coffee before sitting at the table, of the mother who listened too much and was listened to too little, of the grandmother who cared for others while forgetting to care for herself. And then I remembered that what I did wasn't an exaggeration, it was repair. A course, adjustment, a return to my essence. Because what was the point of being surrounded by people who only saw me when it was convenient? What value is there in the smile of someone who doesn't respect me? And what comfort is there in sharing a roof with someone who treats us like an old piece of furniture that only serves as long as it's useful? This new phase didn't bring me noise, but it did bring me truth. And with truth came a freedom I'd never felt before. The freedom to no longer need to prove anything, to not smile when I don't want to not say yes just to maintain a peace that was never mine. It's funny how we spend our entire lives trying to be accepted by others, and only understand the true value of life when we learn to accept ourselves first. And that's what this journey taught me, that not all silence is loneliness, that not all distance is rejection, and that sometimes the price of being heard is the same as being left aside. But even so, it's worth it, because living in silence to be accepted is what slowly kills us, but living in peace with who we are is what saves us. If you've ever had to give up something or someone to maintain your dignity, right here in the comments. It was difficult, but it was liberating. Because in the end, the truth may push some people away, but it brings you closer to yourself. Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns, and when it does, it doesn't ask if we're ready. It simply comes and takes its toll. And it takes its toll in the currency that hurts the most, our conscience. Today, I'm still in that house, the same room, the same backyard, the same smell of coffee that fills the air early in the morning, but inside me, everything has changed. There's no longer that desire to be accepted at any cost. There's no longer that anguish of being seen. I see myself, and that alone is enough. Vanessa walks through the rooms with more measured steps. The cutting comments, once spoken aloud, have now turned into long silences. She speaks little, and when she does speak, she measures her words as if treading on broken glass. Mark, for his part, tries to smooth over the edges of their coexistence, with small kindnesses, as if trying to mend what was torn inside. But the seam between us will never be the same again. And I understand that there are bonds that don't break, but that also don't return to what they were. They adapt, like old fabrics. After much use, they no longer shape the same way, but they still cover, still warm. They still exist. I don't carry resentment, I carry memory, because to forget would be to deny my journey, and to deny what I experienced would be to erase the very thing that strengthened me. And today, I am made of this, of memory, of scars, of overcoming. The most important thing I learned on this journey was this, that justice doesn't always come from others. Sometimes, justice comes from within. When we stop putting ourselves down, when we stop accepting less, when we look in the mirror and, for the first time in a long time, recognize ourselves with pride. It's not about revenge, it's about conscience. It's about giving back to yourself what was taken without asking, the right to exist with respect, to age with dignity, to be a voice even after so long of silence. And as much as it hurts to admit, sometimes, what isn't learned with love, life teaches with pain, and what is planted, sooner or later, blossoms, or hurts. Therefore, I repeat with a calm heart and my head held high, never treat someone who gave you a roof over your head like a maid. Life takes its toll. And sometimes, with interest if this made sense to you, if it touched on a forgotten wound or sparked a new way of looking at yourself, right here in the comments. Today I am whole, because being whole isn't about having everything, it's about not losing yourself even when they try to erase your history. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story truly touched you, and that says a lot. Because when we listen with our hearts, it's a sign that we also carry scars, experiences, or a desire to see things more clearly. If this video made you think, if it touched something deep inside you, please leave a like. Not only to strengthen this space, but because it shows that this kind of conversation makes sense, that it's worth continuing to tell stories that need to be heard. And if you want to continue following this kind of content, stories that bring truth, emotion, and that feeling that you're not alone, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is made for you to see yourself, recognize yourself, and who knows, maybe even heal a little. And if you went all the way with me, comment below, I'm with you until the end. That's how I know who really walked with me through every piece of this story. There's a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over yet.